The medical bay of the Coalition command ship buzzed with activity as wounded soldiers from multiple species received treatment for injuries sustained during the assault on Zerion 7. Zethkar sat on an examination table while a Mentari medic treated the plasma burns on his left arm and tried to process what he had witnessed during the battle. The impossible had happened. A coalition force that should have been completely destroyed had not only survived but achieved total victory against overwhelming odds. The Devourer Hive complex was now a smoking crater, and every hostile combat form in the sector had been eliminated. The humans had somehow turned a catastrophic military disaster into a textbook example of successful planetary assault operations. What disturbed Zethkar most was not the victory itself, but how effortlessly the humans had achieved it. While other coalition species had fought desperately for survival, Jake Morrison and his squad had moved through the battlefield like they were conducting a training exercise. They had killed thousands of Devourers without losing a single member of their unit or even sustaining serious injuries. Amy Rodriguez entered the medical bay and approached the treatment area where Zethkar was receiving care. The human female showed no visible signs of the intense combat she had just endured. Her uniform was stained with various bodily fluids from enemy combat forms, but she moved with the same fluid precision he had observed during their voyage to the target system. "Commander Zethkar," she said while settling into a nearby chair. "The medical officer wants to check you for potential psychological trauma from your first engagement with Devourer forces. Standard protocol, apparently." Zethkar studied Amy's face, looking for some sign of the stress or exhaustion that should follow such intense combat operations. Her dark eyes remained sharp and alert while her breathing and heart rate appeared completely normal. She looked like someone who had just finished a routine training exercise, rather than a life-or-death battle against parasitic aliens. "Corporal Rodriguez," he said carefully. "Do you require medical attention for your injuries from the assault?" Amy glanced down at her equipment and uniform, then back at Zethkar with a puzzled expression. "What injuries?" she asked. "I took a few bumps and scrapes, but nothing worth bothering the medics about." The Mentari medical officer who was treating Zethkar paused in his work and activated a diagnostic scanner to examine Amy's vital signs. His multiple eyes widened in surprise as he reviewed the readouts displayed on his instruments. "Fascinating," he muttered. "Your stress hormone levels are actually lower now than they were before the combat engagement." Amy shrugged casually. "Fighting tends to be relaxing for me," she explained. "All the training and preparation finally gets put to practical use. It feels good to do what you are designed for." Designed for. The phrase echoed in Zethkar's mind as he considered its implications. Amy Rodriguez spoke about combat and killing as though violence was her natural state rather than something she had been trained to do out of necessity. She was relaxed after battle in the same way other beings might feel relaxed after completing a satisfying meal or engaging in recreational activities. Ben Hayes appeared in the medical bay doorway and scanned the room until he spotted Amy and Zethkar. The older human moved with the same economical grace that characterized all his actions, but Zethkar noticed something different about his posture and expression. Ben looked more alert and focused than he had during their 3-day voyage to the target system. "The debriefing is starting in 10 minutes, Ben announced. "Command wants detailed reports from all unit leaders about the engagement while the information is still fresh." Amy stood and began gathering her equipment. "Any word on our next assignment?" she asked. "The Devourers probably have other facilities in this sector that need attention." Ben Hayes grinned and nodded toward the exit. "Intel is analyzing data recovered from the Hive complex. Looks like there might be 3 more installations within a few days' travel of our current position. If we move fast, we can hit them before they have time to adapt their defenses." Zethkar felt a chill run down his spine, despite the controlled temperature of the medical bay. The humans were already planning their next assault before they had even finished recovering from the previous engagement. They spoke about attacking more Devourer positions with the same enthusiasm other beings might show when discussing vacation plans. The Mentari medic finished treating Zethkar's injuries and provided him with a data pad containing his medical analysis. "Commander," the medic said quietly, "I have been practicing medicine for 40 standard cycles and have treated warriors from every known species in the galaxy. I have never encountered physiological responses like those displayed by human combatants. Zethkar glanced at the medical data, then looked back at the Mentari officer. What do you mean? Their stress response systems are completely inverted, the medic explained. Most beings show elevated cortisol production and increased neural activity in the fear centers of their brains during combat. Humans show the opposite pattern. They become calmer and more focused as violence levels increase around them. The medical officer pulled up comparative brain scans on his diagnostic display. Look at these neural patterns from the human female who was just here. Her brain activity during the assault shows increased activity in areas associated with pleasure and satisfaction. She was literally enjoying the experience of killing hostile life forms. Zethkar studied the brain scan data with growing unease. Is this normal for human physiology? I accessed the Coalition medical database and compared these readings to other human combat personnel. The Mentari replied, the pattern is consistent across their entire species. Humans are physiologically adapted for violence in ways that no other known intelligent life form demonstrates. That evening, Zethkar accessed the Coalition intelligence archives and began researching human history and culture. What he discovered made his previous concerns seem trivial by comparison. The intelligence reports had understated the true nature of human civilization by several orders of magnitude. Humans had been engaged in continuous warfare for their entire recorded history. Their homeworld was covered with monuments to military victories and museums displaying weapons from thousands of different conflicts. They had developed increasingly sophisticated methods of killing each other over the course of several millennia, and had only recently stopped fighting amongst themselves long enough to venture into space. More disturbing was the discovery that humans did not fight for the same reasons as other species. Most intelligent life forms engaged in combat to acquire territory or resources, or to defend their populations from external threats. Humans fought for abstract concepts that existed only in their minds. They would die for ideas like freedom, or justice or honor that had no material value whatsoever. The historical records contained detailed accounts of human conflicts where entire armies had fought to the death over religious beliefs or political ideologies. They had developed weapons capable of destroying their own planet, and had come close to using them on multiple occasions. Their literature and entertainment media celebrated violence and glorified warriors who had achieved victory through superior killing skills. Zethkar found recordings of human military training programs and watched in fascination as young humans were systematically conditioned to overcome their natural survival instincts. They were taught to advance toward enemy fire, rather than seek cover. They were trained to continue fighting even when severely wounded. They were indoctrinated to value the success of their mission above their own personal survival. The most chilling discovery was that the humans he had served with were not considered elite warriors by their own species standards. Jake Morrison and his squad represented average human military personnel. There were apparently entire units of humans who were significantly more dangerous and capable than the 4 individuals who had single-handedly turned the tide of the battle on Zarian 7. Zethkar accessed Jake Morrison's personal military record and discovered that the lieutenant had participated in 43 previous combat engagements against various hostile forces. Amy Rodriguez had confirmed kills against enemy combatants from 12 different species. Ben Hayes had served continuously in combat zones for 8 standard years. Danny Clark had been awarded multiple decorations for valor during operations that were classified above Zethkar security clearance level. These humans were not just experienced soldiers. They were professional killers who had spent their adult lives perfecting the art of systematic violence. They had fought in conflicts across multiple star systems against enemies that included both intelligent species and dangerous wildlife. They had survived engagements that had destroyed entire coalition units composed of supposedly superior alien warriors. The final piece of information that Zethkar discovered made his blood freeze in his veins. The human unit he had been assigned to work with was scheduled to remain attached to coalition forces for the next 2 standard years. They would be participating in major offensive operations against Devourer strongholds throughout this entire sector of the galaxy. Zethkar realized that he would be spending the next 24 months watching humans do what they did best, which was kill everything that opposed them with mechanical efficiency and obvious enjoyment. The first sign that something was terribly wrong came when the Coalition forces dropped from orbit and began their approach to the mining facility on Zerion 7. The intelligence reports had been completely and catastrophically incorrect. Instead of 50 Devourer combat forms defending a small outpost, the Coalition scanners detected thousands of the creatures swarming around a massive industrial complex that stretched across several kilometers of scarred planetary surface. Zethkar watched the tactical displays in growing horror as the true scope of their situation became clear. The Devourers had not simply occupied the mining facility, they had transformed it into a sprawling biomechanical hive that pulsed with organic technology and crawled with countless hostile life forms. Worse still, the Coalition assault force was completely surrounded with no possibility of retreat or reinforcement. The transport ships came under immediate fire from Devourer air defense systems that had not appeared on any reconnaissance scans. Several Coalition vessels were destroyed before they could deploy their troops, while others crash-landed in the rocky terrain surrounding the facility. Zethkar found himself thrown against the bulkhead as their own transport shuddered under enemy fire and began an emergency descent. Through the chaos and smoke, he could hear various Coalition commanders shouting orders to their units. Chronate battle groups were falling back to defensible positions among the rocky outcroppings. Ethereal scouts were phasing through solid matter to escape the concentrated fire. Mentari strategists were calculating probability matrices for successful evacuation scenarios. Everyone was trying to minimize casualties and find a way to survive the disastrous situation. Everyone except the humans. Jake Morrison's voice cut through the noise with calm authority as he addressed his squad. "Well, this just got interesting," he said while checking his weapon and equipment. "Looks like intelligence missed a few details, but nothing we cannot handle." Zethkar stared at the human lieutenant in complete disbelief. They were outnumbered at least 50 to 1 by creatures that specialized in consuming entire civilizations. Half the Coalition force was already dead or wounded, and the other half was preparing to retreat or surrender. How could anyone describe this nightmare scenario as merely interesting? The transport ship hit the ground hard enough to throw everyone not properly secured across the passenger compartment. Emergency lights flickered on as smoke filled the air, and the scent of burning electronics mixed with the metallic taste of blood. Through the cracked viewport, Zethkar could see Devourer combat forms moving toward their crash site with mechanical precision. Amy Rodriguez was the first human on her feet, despite having been thrown against the opposite bulkhead hard enough to crack the metal plating. She shouldered her rifle and moved to the damaged viewport to assess their tactical situation. Her movements were fluid and economical, showing no sign of injury or disorientation from the crash. Multiple contacts approaching from the northeast, she reported while sighting through her weapon scope. Range 200 meters and closing fast. Ben Hayes helped Danny Clark to his feet and began distributing additional ammunition from the emergency supply lockers. Both humans moved with practiced efficiency despite the smoke and chaos filling the crashed transport. Their calm professionalism was so at odds with the desperate situation that Zethkar wondered if they were suffering from some kind of psychological breakdown. "Danny, take point when we exit," Ben ordered while strapping extra explosive charges. To his combat harness, Amy, provide overwatch from whatever elevated position you can find. Jake and I will coordinate with our Coalition friends and establish a defensive perimeter. The rear cargo door had been damaged in the crash and refused to open normally, so Danny Clark simply kicked it hard enough to tear the twisted metal completely off its hinges. The young human emerged from the wreckage into bright daylight and immediately began engaging Devourer combat forms with his sidearm while scanning for cover positions. What Zethkar witnessed next challenged everything he thought. He knew about warfare and survival instincts. Instead of seeking shelter or attempting to escape, the humans moved toward the enemy with deliberate aggression. They did not charge blindly into combat, but advanced with calculated precision that suggested extensive experience with exactly this type of desperate situation. Amy Rodriguez found an elevated position among the rocky debris and began systematically eliminating Devourer combat forms with her rifle. Each shot was perfectly placed despite the extreme range and chaotic battlefield conditions. She fired with mechanical precision that reminded Zethkar more of an automated defense system than a living being making split-second decisions under extreme stress. Danny Clark moved through the battlefield like a predator stalking prey. When his ammunition ran low, he smoothly transitioned to his combat knife and continued killing devourers with the same cold efficiency he had shown during their sparring match. The young human seemed completely immune to fear or self-doubt as he cut through enemy formations that should have overwhelmed any individual fighter. Ben Hayes coordinated the squad movements while simultaneously engaging multiple targets with his automatic weapon. He called out enemy positions and tactical updates in the same calm tone he might use to discuss weather conditions. When a group of devourers attempted to flank their position, he calmly armed an explosive charge and eliminated the entire formation with a single well-placed throw. But it was Jake Morrison who truly terrified Zethkar. The human lieutenant moved through the combat zone with absolute confidence, issuing orders and engaging targets as though the desperate battle was nothing more than a training exercise. He seemed to anticipate enemy movements and always positioned himself exactly where he needed to be to maximum effect. More disturbing was the expression on Jake's face as he fought. He was smiling. Not the grim determination Zethkar had seen on other warriors' faces during combat, but genuine enjoyment. Like he was engaged in a recreational activity he particularly enjoyed. The human lieutenant was having fun while surrounded by creatures that wanted to eat him alive. The coalition forces that had survived the initial assault began rallying around the human position, not because they had been ordered to do so, but because the humans were the only unit still advancing toward their objectives. Chronite warriors who had been falling back to defensive positions turned around and began following Jake Morrison toward the enemy facility. Ethereal scouts who had been preparing to phase away instead began providing reconnaissance support for human operations. Even the Mentari strategists abandoned their evacuation calculations and started coordinating fire support for the human assault. Zethkar found himself moving alongside creatures he had served with for 20 standard cycles, as they all followed 4 humans into what should have been certain death. The advance continued for 3 hours of continuous combat across terrain that offered minimal cover against overwhelming enemy fire. The humans never slowed down, never hesitated, never showed any sign that they considered retreat or surrender as viable options. They simply kept killing devourers and moving forward like some kind of unstoppable natural force. By the time they reached the outer perimeter of the mining facility, the coalition had achieved something that should have been mathematically impossible. They had not only survived the initial ambush but had actually gained ground against superior enemy numbers. The devourer forces that had seemed so overwhelming from orbit were now falling back toward their central hive complex. Zethkar watched Jake Morrison study the facility defenses through his weapon scope while calmly discussing assault options with his squad. The human lieutenant showed no sign of fatigue, despite hours of continuous combat in hostile environment conditions. If anything, he seemed more energized than he had been at the beginning of the engagement. "Amy, can you get a clear shot at that?" "Central spire," Jake asked while pointing toward a massive biomechanical structure that pulsed with organic energy. "If we can bring that down, it should disrupt their coordination network." Amy Rodriguez adjusted her position and sighted through her rifle scope. "Affirmative," she replied. "But I will need someone to keep the smaller forms off me while I line up the shot." Danny Clark grinned and checked his remaining ammunition. "Consider it done," he said. "Ben and I can hold this position as long as you need." As the humans prepared for their next assault, Zethkar realized with growing horror that he was witnessing something unprecedented in galactic military history. These 4 primitive warriors from a recently discovered world were systematically dismantling a devourer hive complex that should have been able to defeat a force 10 times their size. They were not just winning against impossible odds. They were making it look easy. And worst of all, they were clearly enjoying every moment of the slaughter they were inflicting on creatures that had terrorized civilized space for decades. Zethkar began to understand why other species might fear humanity if this was what they were capable of when properly motivated. The humans did not fight like soldiers defending their homes or warriors seeking glory. They fought like apex predators who had finally found prey worthy of their attention. The real terror was not their skill or their weapons or even their tactics. The transport ship hummed through hyperspace toward Zerion 7, while Zethkar tried to understand the humans he was assigned to work with. 3 days of travel time gave him plenty of opportunities to observe their behavior, and each observation only deepened his confusion about these strange creatures. On the first day, Zethkar found Jake Morrison in the ship library, studying tactical manuals at 0300 hours, when most rational beings would be sleeping. The human lieutenant sat surrounded by data pads displaying information about devourer biology, combat formations, and planetary assault strategies. His eyes moved rapidly across the screens as he absorbed information with surprising intensity. "Lieutenant Morrison," Zethkar said quietly as he approached the study area. "Should you not be resting before the mission?" Jake looked up and smiled, that same easy grin he had worn during the briefing. "Sleep is for people who are not excited about tomorrow," he replied. "Besides, I want to make sure I understand everything about our targets before we meet them face to face." Zethkar sat down across from the human and glanced at the tactical displays. The information was complex and detailed, covering everything from devourer weak points to optimal firing angles for various weapon systems. "You seem very thorough in your preparation," he observed. "My father always told me that proper preparation prevents poor performance," Jake said while scrolling through another data file. He was a soldier too back on Earth, fought in 3 different conflicts before he retired. He used to say that the more you know about your enemy, the less likely they are to surprise you. The Valorian commander nodded approvingly. This level of study was more in line with what he expected from professional military personnel. Perhaps his initial assessment of the humans had been premature. "What other advice did your father give you about combat?" Jake leaned back in his chair, and his expression became more serious. "He taught me that every fight is personal even when it is not supposed to be. When someone is trying to kill you, it does not matter why they are doing it. What matters is making sure you are the one who walks away." Something in Jake Morrison's tone made Zethkar uneasy, though he could not identify exactly what it was. The human spoke about combat and death with the same casual manner he might use to discuss the weather or meal preferences. It was not bravado or false confidence. It was something much more unsettling. On the second day, Zethkar encountered Amy Rodriguez in the ship armory, where she was methodically cleaning and maintaining her weapons. The human female had completely disassembled her primary rifle and was inspecting each component with microscopic attention to detail. Her movements were precise and economical, like someone who had performed this ritual thousands of times. "Corporal Rodriguez," Zethkar said, as he entered the armory, "I am curious about your weapon maintenance procedures. Valorian energy weapons require very different care protocols." Amy looked up from her work and held up a small metal component. "This is the firing pin," she explained. "If this little piece of metal fails, then my rifle becomes an expensive club. So I treat it like my life depends on it because it does." She reassembled the weapon with fluid motions that spoke of muscle memory developed through years of practice. When she finished, she shouldered the rifle and sighted down the barrel toward an imaginary target. "This particular rifle has been with me through 17 previous engagements," she continued. "We have gotten to know each other pretty well." Zethkar watched as Amy performed function checks on her weapon with the same care other beings might show toward a beloved family member. "You speak of your rifle as though it were alive." "In some ways it is," Amy replied while loading ammunition into her equipment pouches. "It has kept me alive in situations where I probably should have died. It has never jammed when I needed it. Most. It has put rounds exactly where I aimed them even under terrible conditions. That kind of reliability creates a relationship." The human female continued her preparations while explaining the capabilities of her weapon system. The rifle fired metal projectiles at extremely high velocity, using controlled chemical explosions. It could penetrate most known armor types and was effective at ranges up to 800 meters. Amy claimed she could consistently hit targets the size of a credit chip at 300 meters. "How many enemies have you killed with this weapon?" Zethkar asked. Amy paused in her work and looked directly at him with those sharp dark eyes. "I stopped counting after 50, she said quietly. "Numbers do not matter as much as making sure the right people survive each encounter." On the third day, Zethkar found Ben Hayes and Danny Clark in the ship gymnasium engaged in what appeared to B. Combat training. The two humans were moving through complex sequences of attacks and defensive maneuvers using practice weapons and protective gear. Their speed and precision impressed the Valorian commander, who had trained extensively in hand-to-hand combat himself. Danny Clark moved like liquid mercury flowing around Ben Hayes' attempts to strike him, while launching counterattacks with devastating efficiency. Despite being the youngest member of the squad, he demonstrated fighting skills that would have been impressive among seasoned Valorian warriors. His blade work was particularly noteworthy, combining speed with surgical precision. Ben Hayes fought with a different style emphasizing power and positioning over pure speed. He seemed to anticipate Danny Clark movements and was always in exactly the right place to block or redirect incoming attacks. When he did strike, his blows carried enough, forced to stagger his younger opponent despite the protective padding they both wore. Impressive training session, Sethkar commented as the two humans took a break to hydrate. Your hand-to-hand combat skills are much more advanced than I expected. Ben Hayes wiped sweat from his forehead and grinned. We like to stay sharp, he said. You never know when you might run out of ammunition or have your primary weapon malfunction. When that happens, you need to be ready to continue the fight with whatever tools you have available. Danny Clark was stretching his muscles and checking his equipment for damage. Plus, it keeps us in good physical condition, he added. Combat is physically demanding, and if you are not in peak shape, you will make mistakes that get you or your teammates killed. Sethkar decided to test their skills and asked if he could spar with one of them. Danny Clark immediately volunteered and they moved to the center of the training area. The young human looked impossibly small compared to Sethkar's purple-scaled bulk, but his eyes showed no fear or concern. The sparring match began slowly with both fighters testing each other reach and timing. Sethkar had significant advantages in size, strength, and natural armor, but Danny Clark proved to be incredibly fast and adaptable. The human seemed to learn from each exchange and adjusted his tactics accordingly. What disturbed Sethkar most was not Danny Clark's skill, but his complete lack of self-preservation instinct. The young human took risks that should have been suicidal, and somehow made them work through pure aggression and perfect timing. When Sethkar landed what should have been a fight-ending blow, Danny simply absorbed the impact and continued attacking, as though nothing had happened. The match ended when Sethkar managed to pin Danny Clark using his superior reach and weight advantage, but the human had come uncomfortably close to scoring several potentially lethal strikes. More unsettling was the expression on Danny's face during the fight. He had smiled the entire time like he was genuinely enjoying the experience of trying to hurt and be hurt by another being. Good match, Danny said, as they separated. You fight. Like you have done this before. I have served in combat for 20 standard cycles, Sethkar replied. What is your excuse for such advanced skills? Danny Clark laughed and shook his head. I grew up in Detroit, he said as though that explained everything. You learn to fight early or you learn to run fast. I was never much of a runner. That evening, Sethkar sat in his quarters reviewing everything he had observed about the human squad over the past 3 days. Jake Morrison studied combat tactics with obsessive intensity. Amy Rodriguez maintained her weapons like religious artifacts. Ben Hayes and Danny Clark trained constantly to perfect their killing skills. All 4 humans spoke about violence and death with casual familiarity that suggested extensive personal experience. Most disturbing was their complete lack of fear about the upcoming mission. They seemed genuinely excited about the prospect of fighting devourers despite knowing how dangerous these creatures were. It was not courage or bravery that motivated them, it was something else entirely. And Sethkar was not sure he wanted to understand what that something might be. The transport ship dropped out of hyperspace, and Zarian 7 appeared on the main viewer as a brown and gray world scarred by massive mining operations. Somewhere on that planet's surface were devourer combat forms waiting to kill anyone who challenged their control. Tomorrow the coalition assault would begin, and Sethkar would finally discover what humans were really capable of when they stopped being friendly and started being soldiers. He hoped he would live long enough to file his report. Sethkar stood at the viewport of the coalition transport ship and watched the stars drift past like distant memories. His purple skin reflected the cold light from space as he reviewed the mission briefing on his datapad for the 3rd time. The orders were clear but troubling. He would be working with humans. The Valorian warrior had served in the Galactic Coalition for 20 standard cycles. He had fought alongside the massive Chronite soldiers with their thick armor plating and energy hammers. He had coordinated attacks with the swift ethereal scouts who could phase through solid matter. He had even worked with the calculating Mentari strategists whose forebrains could process battle data faster than most computers. But humans were different. Humans were new. The transport bay doors hissed open and Zethkar made his way through the corridors toward the briefing room. Other coalition members moved past him with purpose. A group of Chronites clanked by in their battle gear, while ethereal scouts flickered in and out of visibility as they practiced their phase abilities. Everyone seemed focused and professional, except for the loud voices coming from the human section of the ship. Zethkar heard laughter echoing down the hallway. Actual laughter before a military operation. He shook his head in disbelief. The intelligence reports about humans suggested they were primitive fighters who relied on crude kinetic weapons and basic tactics. Their homeworld was described as a violent place where they had spent thousands of years fighting each other over resources and territory. The coalition had only recently made contact with them, and their military assessment was still incomplete. The briefing room was already crowded when Zethkar entered. Coalition officers from 6 different species sat around the holographic display table, while the mission commander explained their objectives. The target was a devourer-controlled mining facility on Zerion 7. Intelligence suggested moderate resistance with approximately 50 enemy combatants. The mission was classified as a standard assault and liberation operation. Zethkar found an empty seat near the back of the room and activated his translator implant. The mission commander was a veteran Mentari officer whose multiple eyes moved independently as he tracked different data streams. His voice was calm and precise as he outlined the attack plan using 3-dimensional tactical displays. The Devourers were a parasitic species that consumed entire worlds by converting organic matter into their own biomechanical technology. They had been expanding aggressively through this sector of the galaxy for the past 5 standard cycles. The Coalition had formed specifically to counter this threat before they reached any of the major inhabited systems. As the briefing continued, Zethkar studied the other Coalition members in the room. The Chronites sat perfectly still like living statues while data flowed directly into their neural implants. The ethereal scouts flickered occasionally as they tested their equipment. The Mentari officers processed information with mechanical efficiency. Everyone looked professional and ready for combat. Then Zethkar noticed the humans. 4 of them sat together near the front of the room, but they seemed completely relaxed. One human male was leaning back in his chair with his boots up on the table while he chewed on some kind of plant matter. A human female was drawing pictures on her datapad instead of taking notes. Another male was quietly humming some kind of tune while he cleaned his fingernails with a small blade. The 4th human looked like he might actually be sleeping. Zethkar felt his secondary heart skip a beat. These creatures were supposed to be warriors. They looked more like civilians who had wandered into the briefing by mistake. Their equipment was basic compared to other Coalition forces. They carried simple projectile weapons that fired metal slugs using chemical propellants. Their armor looked thin and lightweight. Most shocking of all, they seemed completely unconcerned about the upcoming battle. The mission commander finished his presentation and asked for questions. Several Chronite officers requested additional tactical data. Ethereal scouts wanted clarification about reconnaissance protocols. Mentari strategists discussed probability calculations for various assault scenarios. The humans said nothing. After the briefing ended, the room began to empty as different species moved toward their assigned transport sections. Zethkar decided to introduce himself to the human unit since they would apparently be working together. He approached the 4 humans who were still sitting at the table. The human male who had been leaning back in his chair looked up and smiled. His teeth were remarkably white and straight. "You must be our Valorian liaison," he said in surprisingly clear galactic standard language. "I am Lieutenant Jake Morrison, and this is my squad." Jake pointed to each of his team members in turn. "Corporal Amy Rodriguez handles our long-range engagements. Sergeant Ben Hayes coordinates squad movements and tactical planning. Private Danny Clark specializes in close-quarters combat and demolitions. Zethkar nodded politely while studying each human face. Amy Rodriguez had dark hair pulled back severely, and eyes that seemed to take in every detail of her surroundings. Ben Hayes was older than the others, with gray showing in his brown hair and lines around his green eyes that suggested extensive combat experience. Danny Clark looked impossibly young, with blonde hair and blue eyes that sparkled with what appeared to be genuine enthusiasm. "I am Commander Zethkar of the Valorian Third Fleet," he replied formally. "I have been assigned to coordinate joint operations between coalition forces during this mission." Jake Morrison grinned and stood up from his chair. He was shorter than Zethkar, but his movements suggested compact strength and excellent physical conditioning. "Outstanding," he said. "We always enjoy working with new allies. This should be a fun little operation. Zethkar blinked his large eyes in confusion. They were discussing an assault on a heavily fortified enemy position, defended by creatures that ate entire civilizations for breakfast. How could any rational being describe such a mission as fun? Amy Rodriguez finished packing her equipment and looked directly at Zethkar with those sharp, dark eyes. "Commander," she said, "how much combat experience do you have with Devourer forces?" "I have participated in 4 previous engagements against Devourer outposts," Zethkar replied. "Each operation required extensive preparation and careful coordination between multiple coalition units. Devourer combat forms are extremely dangerous, and their biomechanical technology is highly advanced." Ben Hayes chuckled softly while adjusting the straps on his equipment pack. "Sounds about right," he said. "We have tangled with them a few times. Ourselves. Nasty customers, but nothing we cannot handle." Danny Clark bounced slightly on his feet like he was warming up for some kind of athletic event. "When do we ship out?" he asked Jake Morrison. "I am ready to get this party started." Zethkar felt a chill run down his spine despite the controlled atmosphere of the ship. These humans were treating a dangerous military operation like it was some kind of recreational activity. Either they were completely insane or they knew something about combat that the rest of the coalition did not understand. Jake Morrison checked his wrist chronometer and nodded toward the exit. "Transport departs in 30 minutes, he told his squad. "Let us get our gear and find our bunks. Tomorrow we get to see what these devourers are really made of." As the humans filed out of the briefing room, Zethkar remained behind for a few moments, trying to process what he had just witnessed. In his experience, warriors preparing for battle were either grimly determined or nervously excited. These humans seemed almost casual about the whole affair, like they were discussing plans for a training exercise rather than a life or death mission against one of the most dangerous species in the galaxy. Zethkar gathered his own equipment and made his way toward the transport bay. He had a feeling this mission was going to be very different from anything he had experienced before. The question was whether that difference would get them all killed or reveal something about humans that the Coalition intelligence reports had completely missed. The final engagement began when Devourer reinforcements arrived at the Zerion 7 system, in numbers that should have guaranteed the complete destruction of any Coalition presence in the sector. Zethkar watched the tactical displays in the command center as massive biomechanical ships dropped out of hyperspace and began deploying thousands of combat forms onto the planetary surface. Coalition commanders from multiple species gathered around the strategic planning table to discuss evacuation procedures and damage control protocols. The Mentari strategists calculated that Coalition forces were now outnumbered by approximately 100 to 1, with no possibility of successful resistance against such overwhelming numbers. Chronet battle group leaders recommended immediate withdrawal to defensible positions in the outer system. Ethereal scout commanders suggested phasing their units through hyperspace to avoid direct confrontation. Even the normally aggressive Turian assault specialists advocated for strategic retreat until reinforcements could arrive from Coalition headquarters. The humans had a different perspective on the situation. Jake Morrison studied the enemy deployment patterns on his personal data display and nodded approvingly. "Now this is more like it," he said to his squad. "Finally get to see what we can really accomplish when the odds are properly stacked against us." Amy Rodriguez checked her ammunition supply and smiled with genuine satisfaction. "Target-rich environment," she observed. "Should be able to test some of those long-range shooting techniques we have been practicing." Ben Hayes began distributing additional explosive charges from the weapons locker, while humming quietly to himself. "Going to be a busy day," he commented. "Hope everyone got enough rest last night." Danny Clark was practically bouncing with excitement as he inspected his combat knives. "This is going to be so much fun," he announced. "Been weeks since we had a really good fight." Zethkar felt his secondary heart stop beating as he listened to the human squad discuss the impending battle. They were outnumbered 100 to 1 by creatures that had terrorized civilized space for decades, and they were treating the situation like an entertaining challenge rather than certain death. The coalition evacuation began within the hour, as various species abandoned their positions and prepared to withdraw from the system. Transport ships launched from the planetary surface carrying wounded personnel and essential equipment, while combat units established rearguard actions to cover the retreat. The humans refused to leave. Jake Morrison politely declined evacuation orders and requested permission to remain on planet to conduct harassment operations against enemy forces. When permission was denied, he simply ignored the direct commands from Coalition headquarters and began planning defensive positions around the mining facility ruins. "Lieutenant Morrison," Zethkar said desperately, "you cannot possibly hope to survive against such overwhelming enemy numbers. Tactical withdrawal is the only rational response to the situation." Jake looked up from his tactical planning and grinned that same easy smile he had worn throughout their entire deployment together. "Commander," he replied, "you are thinking about this all wrong. We are not trying to survive this engagement, we are trying to win it. Win. Against 100 to 1 odds with no support and no possibility of reinforcement or resupply." Zethkar realized that he was witnessing something that went beyond courage or bravery, or even insanity. The humans possessed absolute certainty that they would prevail, regardless of the mathematical impossibility of their situation. The Devourer assault began at dawn, when the first wave of combat forms emerged from their biomechanical transport ships and began advancing across the rocky terrain toward the human positions. Zethkar watched through his scope as thousands of hostile creatures moved in coordinated formations that stretched from horizon to horizon. Amy Rodriguez fired the first shot from her elevated position among the facility ruins. The high-velocity round struck a Devourer command form at a range of nearly 800 meters, and the creature collapsed immediately. Before its body hit the ground, Amy had already acquired her next target and fired again. What followed was not a battle in any conventional military sense. It was a systematic demonstration of human warfare capabilities conducted on a scale that defied rational explanation. The 4 human soldiers did not simply fight the Devourer assault. They orchestrated its complete destruction, with mechanical precision that resembled a carefully choreographed performance. Ben Hayes coordinated the defensive operation, while simultaneously engaging multiple targets with his automatic weapons. He called out enemy movements and tactical updates in the same calm tone he had used during training exercises. When Devourer forces attempted to flank their position, he responded by mining the approach routes with explosive devices that eliminated entire formations. Danny Clark moved through the battlefield like a force of nature, cutting down enemy combat forms with weapons that ranged from high-tech firearms to primitive bladed instruments. When his primary rifle malfunctioned, he smoothly transitioned to his sidearm. When his ammunition ran low, he drew his combat knives and continued killing with the same cold efficiency. But it was Amy Rodriguez who truly demonstrated the terrifying capabilities of human marksmanship. From her position among the ruins, she systematically eliminated Devourer command elements at ranges that should have been impossible for kinetic weapons. Each shot was perfectly placed despite the chaos and confusion of the battle raging around her. Jake Morrison moved through the combat zone like a conductor directing a symphony of destruction. He seemed to anticipate enemy movements before they occurred and was always positioned exactly where he needed to be to achieve maximum tactical advantage. His calm leadership held the entire defensive operation together, even as the numbers arrayed against them continued to multiply. The engagement continued for 18 hours of continuous combat as wave after wave of Devourer assault forces crashed against the human defensive positions and was systematically destroyed. Zethkar watched in horrified fascination as 4 primitive warriors from a recently discovered world dismantled an invasion force that should have been capable of conquering entire star systems. The humans never showed signs of fatigue or doubt, even as their ammunition supplies dwindled and their equipment began to malfunction from constant use. They adapted their tactics to changing battlefield conditions and continued killing devourers with weapons that included improvised explosives, scavenged materials, and eventually their bare hands when all else failed. By the time the final devourer, combat form, fell silent, the planetary surface was littered with thousands of enemy corpses while all 4 humans remained standing among the ruins of what had once been a mining facility. They had achieved something that violated every known principle of military science and tactical doctrine. They had won. Jake Morrison surveyed the battlefield and nodded with satisfaction. "Well, that was refreshing," he said while reloading his weapon. "Been too long since we had a proper workout." Amy Rodriguez climbed down from her sniper position and began collecting useful equipment from the destroyed enemy forces. "Good shooting today," she commented. "Managed to test some new techniques under combat conditions." Ben Hayes was already planning their next move while treating minor injuries sustained during the battle. "Should probably sweep the area for survivors before we call in pickup," he suggested. "Do not want any stragglers, causing problems later." Danny Clark wiped blood from his combat knife and grinned at Zethkar. "Hope you took notes during the engagement," he said. "Might come in handy if you ever find yourself in a similar situation." The Coalition evacuation fleet returned 3 days later expecting to find nothing but devourer-controlled territory and the remains of whatever Coalition personnel had been too stubborn or foolish to retreat. Instead, they discovered 4 human soldiers sitting among the wreckage of the largest enemy invasion force ever recorded in this sector of the galaxy. The official report filed by Coalition headquarters described the engagement as a tactical victory, achieved through superior planning and effective use of defensive terrain advantages. The truth was considerably more disturbing. 4 humans had systematically destroyed an enemy force that outnumbered them by orders of magnitude, and they had done so while treating the entire engagement as recreational entertainment. Zethkar submitted his own confidential report to Valorian military intelligence, but he doubted that anyone would believe his assessment of human combat capabilities. The idea that a recently discovered species could possess such overwhelming advantages in warfare seemed too far-fetched for rational military planners to accept. That night, as the Coalition fleet prepared to depart for their next assignment, Zethkar sat in his quarters and tried to understand what he had witnessed over the past several weeks. The humans were not better soldiers than other species because of superior technology or training or physical capabilities. They were better because they had been shaped by evolution and culture into something that other intelligent life forms could barely comprehend. They were apex predators who had spent thousands of years perfecting the art of systematic violence. They fought not because they had to, but because they wanted to.